72 Days in Hell, the unbelievable survival story in the Andes Mountains. Friday, October 13, 1972, 3:30 p.m. Young Uruguayan rugby players were joking on the plane, dreaming about the future, and no one knew that in 18 seconds their lives would turn into a nightmare. When the plane's right wing struck a mountain peak, the cabin instantly disintegrated and some passengers were thrown into the void from 4,000 meters high. Those who remained thought they would freeze to death at -30°C in the middle of the world's most savage mountains, hundreds of kilometers from civilization. But the truly horrifying part hadn't begun yet. Ahead of them lay a 72-day struggle for survival, one of humanity's deepest moral dilemmas, and extraordinary courage displayed when all hope seemed lost. The Fairchild FH-227D aircraft was flying from Montevideo to Santiago, Chile's capital. The Old Christians Club rugby team from Uruguay was heading to a match in Chile. There were 40 passengers and 5 crew members on board, mostly young people aged 19 to 25, full of life. Teammates, families, and friends. The pilot encountered difficult weather conditions while crossing the Andes Mountains. The clouds were so dense that visibility was almost zero. He made a calculation error, misjudged the wind speed, and thought the plane had passed Mendoza. In reality, they were still in the middle of the Andes Mountains, at 4,000 meters altitude. At 3:30 p.m., the pilot informed Santiago Control Tower that they were beginning their descent. They started descending for landing. But when they emerged from the clouds, what they saw wasn't the runway concrete, but snow-covered mountain peaks coming directly at them. The pilot tried to climb at the last moment, but it was too late. The plane's right wing struck a mountain peak and broke off. A second later, the left wing broke off too. The plane's tail separated from the fuselage and fell down the mountainside with the passengers inside. As the out-of-control plane fell at 100 meters per second, the fuselage began to disintegrate. Inside the cabin there was panic, screams, and the screeching of metal. Luggage was flying through the air, seats were being torn from their mounts, people were crashing into each other. Nando Paradu was hit on the head by a suitcase and lost consciousness. Roberto Canessa was clutching his seat tightly. Young medical student Gustavo Zerbino was praying. Then the plane hit a glacier. When the fuselage struck the ice, it slowed down as if a giant hand was trying to stop it, but it wasn't enough. After sliding 700 meters on the ice, the plane finally stopped. The front was completely crushed. No cockpit, no wings, no tail. Only a cylindrical metal tube remained, open at the front and back, lying on the ice. After the initial impact there was silence. Then groans, crying sounds, and cries for help began to rise. At the moment of the crash, 12 of the 45 people died, most from the force of impact or being thrown from the plane. That left 33 injured, shocked, and freezing survivors. When the survivors stepped out of the plane fuselage, the view they saw crushed their hopes. In every direction, only massive mountains covered with white snow stretched out. There were no trees, no greenery, no signs of life. Looking around, they realized the nearest civilization was at least 100 kilometers away, though they didn't even know that. The air was so cold it hurt their lungs to breathe. Most were wearing short-sleeved shirts, thin jackets, and sneakers, clothes suitable for Chile's warm summer weather. No one was prepared for the freezing cold of the Andes Mountains at 4,000 meters altitude. The first night was terrible. The wounded were moaning. The cold was so severe their bodies shook uncontrollably. Both ends of the plane fuselage were open and wind came directly inside. They tried to close the holes with luggage and seat parts, but it wasn't enough. Medical students Gustavo Zerbino, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Tintin Vizintin tried to care for the wounded. Their medical knowledge was limited, but they did what they could. They wrapped fractures, cleaned bleeding wounds, tried to calm people. But there were no medicines, no supplies, no antiseptics. The risk of infection was very high. That night, Roberto Canessa's close friend Felipe Maquiriane died from infection caused by his leg injury. By morning, 3 more people had lost their lives. When the first sunlight appeared, the survivors looked around and understood the seriousness of their situation. They had almost no food, some chocolate, a few bottles of wine, a few canned goods. For 33 people, this would only last a few days. For water, they had to melt snow, but this took hours and they could only obtain a very small amount of water. But the greatest hope was their belief that rescue teams would find them. The plane had reported to the control tower. Rescue teams must be on their way. They would be found within a few days. They just needed to hold on. The 2nd, 3rd, 4th days passed. They scanned the sky, ran outside at every plane sound, used pieces from the plane fuselage to make distress signals. But no one came. Food was running out. They were giving each person only 1 square of chocolate and 1 sip of wine per day. Hunger began to be felt, not just a stomach ache, but a hunger that affected the whole body, drained strength, made thinking difficult. On the 8th day, they miraculously found a small transistor radio that worked on the plane. Roy Harley knew a bit about radio electronics and managed to get the radio working. They began listening to news bulletins, searching for information about rescue operations. On the 10th day, they couldn't believe what they heard on the radio. The news anchor coldly announced, "Search and rescue operations for the plane carrying the Uruguayan rugby team have been suspended. The plane has not been found. All passengers are presumed dead." Silence fell over the plane fuselage. Some began to cry. Some angrily pounded their fists in the snow. Some sat silently, staring blankly ahead. Their world had collapsed. No one was looking for them anymore. No one would come. If they wanted to survive, they had to do it themselves. That night, Nando Paradu had just recovered from the blow to his head 10 days earlier in the crash. His mother and sister Susie were also on the plane. His mother had died immediately in the crash. Susie was injured and slowly slipping away from life. Nando had sat by her side every day, talked to her, tried not to lose hope. But that night Susie died too. Nando, sitting next to his sister's cooling body, made a decision. He would get out of here. If rescue wasn't coming, he would walk west himself, cross these mountains, and bring help. There was no other choice. On the 15th day, there was no food left at all. They were drinking melted snow water, but this only quenched their thirst. They needed calories to burn, especially in this freezing cold. They were getting thinner day by day. Their skin clung to their bones. Even sitting still required effort. Some had already broached the subject, but no one wanted to say it out loud. Finally, young medical student Roberto Canessa gathered courage and said, "If we want to live, we need to eat our dead friends." A terrible silence ensued. Some immediately shouted, "No." Some said it was disgusting. Most were devout Catholics, and this was against their faith, their values, their understanding of humanity. How could they do it? These were friends, teammates, loved ones. But Canessa spoke logically and calmly. "If we want to survive here, We need protein. There's no other food. There's no other choice. The souls of the dead are already gone. The bodies are just meat and bone. They would have wanted us to survive. The debate lasted for hours. Some said they would rather die of starvation. Some discussed the moral, religious, and psychological consequences of this decision. Finally, Nando Paradu stood up and said, "If I die, use my body. Let my body be a tool for your survival. What matters is life, the soul. Meat is just meat." These words affected some. Gradually, they reached a compromise. They would only use the bodies of those already dead. No one would be killed. This would be an act of survival, not murder. Taking the first step was the hardest. They went to one of the corpses stored in the snow outside the plane fuselage. Hands were trembling, tears were freezing on their faces. With a sharp piece of metal from the plane, they cut a small piece from the corpse's body. The meat was so frozen it was like stone. They waited for it to thaw in the sun. Then they faced that moment when stomachs churned, hands trembled, eyes closed. The first bite. Some were vomiting. Some were crying. Some swallowed silently and then vowed never to speak of it again. But calories were needed. Life was needed. In the following days, this became a routine. Every morning, a few people would go outside, bring frozen corpse parts, thaw them in the sun, and distribute the daily rations. They did it without speaking, silently. No one would bring up this subject. But this decision was keeping them alive. Their strength gradually began to return. They could move. They could think. And most importantly, they now had the energy to plan their escape from the mountains. On the 29th night, a greater disaster occurred. At midnight, a massive avalanche broke from the mountain peak and came directly toward the plane fuselage. When those sleeping woke to the noise, it was already too late. Tons of snow poured into the open side of the plane fuselage within seconds. Everything was dark, everything was cold, everything was white. The snow buried them, suffocated them. Some died immediately, crushed or suffocated under the weight of the snow. Some screamed in the darkness trying to save themselves. Hands searched for each other in the snow, voices were muffled, panic was everywhere. Nando Paradu was buried under the snow but had a small air pocket where he could breathe. He stayed there for hours, waiting. When morning came, the survivors began digging through the snow. They managed to pull some out. Some they couldn't. 8 more people died in the avalanche. The number of survivors dropped to 19. Despair was at its peak. But at the same time, a determination was born. If they didn't act now, they would all die here. Winter was deepening, the cold was increasing, the avalanche risk continued. Time was running out. Nando Paradu and Roberto Canessa decided to embark on an expedition to get out of the mountains. They prepared for several weeks. They made sleeping bags from torn plane seat covers, created primitive crampons by attaching rope to a pair of shoes, used the plane's glass for sunglasses. On the 62nd day, Paradu and Canessa began walking west. A third person was with them, Antonio Tintin Vizintin. They carried only a few days' worth of food, corpse parts, and the primitive equipment they had made. The first few days were relatively easy. They were walking on ice. But then the real mountains began, steep slopes, deep chasms, ice masses. Their shoes provided no grip on snowy rocks. There were no gloves. Their fingers were freezing. On the third day, they reached a mountain peak, and when they looked west, What they saw crushed their hopes. They had hoped to see green valleys, towns, or signs of civilization. But all they saw was more mountains, more ice, more whiteness. The Andes Mountains stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Tintin Vizintin decided to turn back that night. Food was running out and feeding 3 people was impossible. Crying, he bid farewell to his friends and returned. Nando and Roberto continued walking. On the 9th day, they had almost lost all hope. Their feet were bleeding, their faces were sunburned and peeling, their lips were cracked, they were having difficulty breathing. When Paradu fell, Canessa grabbed him by the shoulder and lifted him up. When Canessa crawled on his knees, Paradu supported him. On the 10th day in the afternoon, they climbed to a mountain peak, and this time what they saw was different. In the distance, very far away, there was a green valley. And inside the valley, small white dots, houses. The way back to civilization. But the valley was still 60 to 70 kilometers away. They continued walking. Their energy was almost exhausted. They could only advance a few hundred meters per hour. But they didn't stop. On the 11th day, they descended into the valley. When they saw the first tree, they cried. When they saw the first green grass, they fell to their knees and kissed the ground. There was life. Civilization was near. On the 12th day, while walking by a river, they saw a man on the opposite bank, a shepherd. They shouted, waved their arms. The man didn't see them at first, then stopped, looked, and began to run away. He had thought they were crazy homeless people. But the next day, the man came back. This time he looked carefully. Nando Paradu wrapped a note around a stone and threw it across the river. The note read, "We had a plane crash in the Andes Mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 12 days. 14 of my friends are still trapped at the crash site. Send help urgently. Save us." The shepherd took the note and ran to the nearest town. The town police called for a helicopter. And on December 13, 1972, exactly 72 days after the crash, 2 helicopters flew to where the plane wreckage was. When the helicopters landed, 14 young men emerged from the plane fuselage, emaciated, bearded, hollow-eyed. They had turned into skeletons. But they were alive. The first helicopter took 6 people. The second helicopter came back the next day and took the rest. They were all taken to hospitals. When the world heard this news, it was shocked. Were there survivors 72 days after a plane crash? It was impossible. But even more shocking was how they had survived. When the press learned the story, some newspapers condemned them for acting savagely and barbarically. Some tried to understand and empathize. The survivors had to defend the difficult decision they had made. Even the church got involved. Fortunately, the clergy showed compassion. In the Christian communion tradition, bread and wine are transformed into the body and blood of Jesus. These people took the bodies of their beloved friends as a source of life. "This is an act of love," they said. The survivors slowly recovered. Some received help from psychologists. Most struggled with the trauma they experienced for years. But they all returned to life, got married, had children, built careers. Years later, one of the survivors said, "There I learned that a person is much stronger than they think. Even in the darkest moment, there is hope. We can accomplish even the most impossible seeming things. But most importantly, if we do it together, if we do it for each other, we can do anything." Nando Paradu and Roberto Canessa remained lifelong friends. Paradu became a businessman and traveled worldwide as a motivational speaker. Canessa became a cardiologist and saved thousands of lives. In the Andes Mountains, still, among the snowy peaks, the remains of that plane wreckage stand. Like a monument that pushed humanity's deepest limits, showed what humans can do to survive, and proved the power of love, hope, and determination. If this incredible survival story moved you, don't forget to hit the like button. The Miracle of the Andes is a true story that demonstrates the power of the human spirit and how deep the survival instinct can be. These 16 people survived under impossible conditions by making incredible decisions and supporting each other. What would you do in this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss history's most incredible stories. See you in the next video.